The EV market is not as it was a few years ago. It's not even close to what people expect it to be right now. You see, over the years, EVs have always been seen as the future of the automaker world. But of late, it's proved to be the complete opposite. EVs have led to some companies counting losses in the millions of dollars all over the world. Even the EV automakers that specialize in EVs are counting losses. On the other hand, there are EV makers in China that have suffered losses to the point where they've gone bankrupt. But why is this happening? Hello everyone and welcome back to our channel. Today we'll look at the reasons behind Chinese EV makers going bankrupt. But before we continue, make sure you leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more amazing updates on your favorite cars. And with that, let's look at the reasons that are making Chinese EV makers go bankrupt. A few years ago, there were reports of hundreds of EV makers in China coming up with new technologies. They were all ambitious to take over the global market, wishing to take a hold of the market and be at the top. However, the reality is completely different from what everyone expected. It's now obvious that there's not enough room for all of them. Just an overview of the problems they're facing. The markets are oversaturated. There's not enough capital for everyone, and the price war is not making things any easier. This has led most of these Chinese EV makers to declare bankruptcy and just die a natural death. One of the results of these companies declaring bankruptcy is the EV graveyard. Just think of it as a place where EVs are dumped. Most large cities across China have one of these, which have hundreds, if not thousands of abandoned electric vehicles. What's even more interesting about this is that they all have license plates, which means that they were bought and registered at some point. But how did they all end up like this? This is a mystery on its own. However, experts are claiming that this was some kind of scheme. Given that most of these abandoned EVs were initially purchased by car-sharing companies, it all makes sense. The beginning of all this was 2 decades ago, when the Chinese government decided to invest billions in what they refer to as new energy vehicles. These are simply vehicles that run on alternative sources of energy, including hybrids, plug-in hybrids, EVs, and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. By the end of the first decade of the 21st century, it was clear that EVs were the only way to catch up with Western legacy car makers. The government went ahead and started pouring millions into startup companies, and with time, the number of EV makers rose to about 500. However, anyone could tell that this wasn't going to last for long. More so when the government started giving stricter conditions for incentives. One of the conditions was to start selling vehicles in certain volumes. This was not proving to be easy. As a result, most of the small startup companies with limited capital became desperate to figure out new ways to get the subsidies they needed. What's that if not an organized scheme? A lot of people are convinced that these companies were selling EVs only to ensure incentives, while car-sharing companies never had any serious intentions to use them regularly. There are other people who are convinced that it is, in fact, the opposite. They've pointed out that these graveyards are filled with first-generation electric vehicles that were not able to keep up with the change in technology and quality. They've also said that this is nothing but a natural process, where most startups end either in bankruptcy or being bought by a larger player. With the death of most of these EV startups, it's safe to say that about 90% of those companies practically don't exist anymore. China has been aiming to be a global leader in EV technology. Because of these, many possibilities for startup companies opened up. Eventually, as we've seen, the number of EV makers went up to about 500 in 2018. It was clear that even though the Chinese economy is huge, it was going to be hard to support them if they didn't sell at least some of those EVs. Most companies managed to gain the necessary technologies and establish production facilities. However, when it was finally time to start making vehicles in volumes, most of them ran out of money. Shortly after, COVID-19 happened, followed by an economic crisis. There was clearly no room for all those companies. According to reports, the number of EV makers dropped by a huge margin last year. The number went from about 500 to just under 100, and it's expected to be even lower than that. With the way things are progressing, it's estimated that more companies will call it quits in the near future. This is because, for them to survive, they need fresh capital. And to get this, you need to sell some cars. However, most of these companies never had decent sales volumes, with most of them remaining at the level of 500 units per quarter. These numbers were simply not good enough to attract new investors. This is why experts are claiming that only about 50 out of 500 companies are still operational. With this, about 90% of the startups practically don't exist anymore. But at the end of it all, It's just a matter of time before all those Walking Dead companies declare bankruptcy. When this happens, the practical numbers might become official, and we would be able to see where we are with all this. With all the struggles to keep making EVs, there's been a great wave of bankruptcy that has been going on. More Chinese EV companies are declaring bankruptcy, while others are in the danger zone of doing the same. To understand how serious this is, about 5 Chinese companies have declared bankruptcy in the past few months. Some of them were even considered to be quite prospective, but that all changed. The main problem causing this is that the market is simply not large enough for all of them. For example, statistics have shown that about 80% of the EV sales in the Chinese car market are held by the top 10 EV manufacturers. This means that 20% of these sales are spread across the rest of the EV makers. Further research has shown that about 1/3 of the currently active EV makers sell more than 2,000 vehicles annually. Given these figures, it's wise to assume that most of these EV makers will sooner or later end. Experts have claimed that there are at least 20 more companies that are expected to declare bankruptcy this year. Among the companies that have already declared bankruptcy, there are some names that were expected to be larger. A great example is Letten, which was even considered to be ahead of Tesla when it comes to sales numbers about 9 years ago. Another company is Neutron, which also declared bankruptcy. The latter can be likened to Evergrande New Energy Auto. This was a company that was part of a Chinese conglomerate that invested billions in the making of electric vehicles. However, even with such a large investment of money, the company never managed to make any decent sales numbers, causing an insane loss of about $17 million on every EV sold. We cannot forget about WM, one of the most recent cases of bankruptcy. This is an EV maker that was very promising, especially when we consider that it was one of the startups with the largest capital, estimated at $5.3 billion. And even though the company achieved some pretty respectable technological achievements, WM was still unable to compete in the current price war. They ended up recording some huge losses. The company is now in a massive restructuring process as they try to get new investors, but things don't look very promising. It's going to prove very hard to keep up with the price war as well as market oversaturation. It's clear that more and more EV companies might declare bankruptcy, given how things are progressing. The EV market is not as it was, and it is slowly dying. But could there be a way to revive this industry? Maybe, maybe not. Do you think that the bankruptcy could be caused by something else? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. And before you go, make sure you leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more amazing updates on your favorite cars. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.